A police officer finds a young girl lost in a city park. Days later, he discovers something that changes his life forever. Ethan was a very helpful police officer who worked in the Department of Pinewood, a small town surrounded by dense forests and crystal-clear lakes. The wind whistled through the trees, scattering dry leaves across the ground in the Central Park. During his patrol, he spotted a beautiful girl. She was alone, sitting on a rusty swing, hugging her knees. Her small figure seemed even smaller in contrast to the vast, empty park. Ethan approached slowly, trying not to startle her. "Hey, hello," he said with a gentle smile. "Are you well?" The girl looked up, revealing large blue eyes that sparkled with a mixture of fear and sadness. She didn't respond, just pursed her lips, as if afraid to say anything. "My name is Ethan. I'm a police officer here in the city. What is your name?" He crouched down to her level, keeping his voice soft. After a moment of hesitation, she murmured, "Sophie." "Hi, Sophie. Do you know where your parents are? Someone must be worried about you." She shook her head slowly. "I don't know where they are." Her voice was so low that Ethan had to lean in closer to hear her. "It's okay, Sophie. Do you want to come with me? Let's go somewhere safe, and we can try to find your parents together, okay?" She hesitated, looking at the floor. Finally, with a small nod, she accepted the hand Ethan extended to her. Arriving at the police station, Ethan led her to a quiet room, away from the main activity. He grabbed a blanket and handed it to her. "Here, so you can stay warm. I'll get you something to eat, okay?" Sophie nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself as if it were a shield against the world. After leaving the room, Ethan decided to send another officer to get food for the young woman from a nearby cafeteria. Meanwhile, he decided to look through the records and look for the girl's parents. His instinct told him something wasn't right, and he needed answers. Upon accessing the files, Ethan found information that made his heart heavy. Sophie's father had died in a car accident 5 years ago. The loss seemed too recent for such a young girl. But what really shook him was his mother's history. Linda Harper, Sophie's mother, had several convictions for drug possession, petty theft, and child neglect. Ethan froze. He felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the computer screen. His chest felt tight, and he had to sit down for a moment to process what he was reading. "I can't leave it like this," he thought, determined. "This girl deserves more than this. She deserves a chance to be happy." The officer returned shortly after, carrying a paper bag with burgers and fries. Ethan thanked him and entered the room where Sophie was again. She was still huddled in the corner, holding the blanket. Her eyes lifted when he entered, but she didn't say anything. "Here, Sophie," he said, placing the bag on the table beside her. "I brought you something to eat. I know you must be hungry." She looked at the bag hesitantly. "Thank you," he murmured, barely audible. Ethan pulled up a chair and sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. He noticed how shy she was, as if every movement was calculated to avoid attracting attention. "Sophie, you can trust me, okay? I want to help you. But to do that, I need to understand what's going on. Can you tell me about your mother? Does she know you're here?" The girl looked away, clutching the blanket to her chest. "I don't want to talk about her," he said, his voice shaking. "Okay," Ethan replied calmly. "We can go in your time. But I need to know if you're safe. Are you scared of her?" Sophie remained silent for a few seconds before slowly nodding. She's not good to me," he confessed, his eyes filling with tears. "What do you mean, Sophie? Does she hurt you?" Ethan asked, leaning a little closer to her, his voice thick with concern. The girl nodded again, this time more quickly. "She screams a lot. And sometimes she hits me. I don't like staying at home." Ethan felt his heart tighten even more. "What about food? Do you have anything to eat there?" Sophie shook her head, tears now streaming down her face. "There's nothing. I left because I was hungry." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to control the anger building inside him. "Sophie, I promise I will take care of you. You won't have to go through this anymore, okay?" She looked at him, a small glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Do you promise?" "I promise," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "You're not alone now." Ethan leaves the room not knowing what to do. In theory, this case did not fall under the jurisdiction of the police, but rather social assistance. However, Ethan was shocked by what he had discovered about Sophie and didn't want to abandon her. He needed to ensure that everything would be okay. At this point, Ethan remembers that his childhood friend, Daniel, worked in social services in Pinewood. Ethan decided to call him right away. "Hello, Daniel. This is Ethan. How are you?" "Ethan, how long?" "I am good, and you?" "Well, as far as possible. Listen, I need your help. I have a complicated situation here." "Sure, say it. What happened?" "I met a girl in the park today. She was alone, and I couldn't locate her parents. I ended up finding out that her father died and her mother. Well, her mother has a bad history. Drugs, neglect, and God knows what else. The girl told me that she doesn't have food at home and that she suffers abuse. I can't just let her go back to that environment." On the other end of the line, Daniel was silent for a moment. "This is terrible. Ethan, you know we need to follow procedures. But from what you're telling me, there's no way she's going back to her mother. I can arrange a temporary home for her, but it will be a delicate transition." "Ethan, I trust you. Let's do this. I'll contact one of the foster homes in Pinewood. It may take a few hours to organize everything, but I will speed up the process. Can you take care of her until then?" "For sure. Thanks, Daniel. I knew I could count on you." Ethan returned to the room where Sophie was. "Hi, Sophie," he began, sitting in the chair across from her. "I talked to a friend of mine, someone who works helping children like you. He managed to find you a safe place to stay, a temporary home, with good people who will take care of you." Sophie's eyes widened, and she seemed to catch her breath. Don't I need to go home?" Ethan shook his head with a reassuring smile. "No, Sophie. You're not going back to that place. I promise." Tears began to stream down the girl's face, but this time they weren't from fear or sadness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so scared of having to go back." Ethan felt a lump in his throat, but he kept his voice steady. "You are very brave, Sophie. And now, you will have a place where you can feel safe, where you will have food and people who care about you. It's going to be okay, Sophie," he said, his voice soft but full of emotion. As he held her, Ethan realized that this girl had already touched his heart in a way he could never have imagined. After a few hours, Daniel arrives at the police station to take Sophie to her temporary home. Ethan's heart sinks to be separated from Sophie, but he knows she is going somewhere safe. "Bye, Sophie. I'll visit you tomorrow, okay?" The girl nodded and left. That night, when Ethan came home from work, he found Clara, his wife, in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Ethan told Clara what had happened at the police station and talked about how touched he was by little Sophie. He expressed his feelings, which immediately moved Clara. Clara was excited to meet little Sophie and insisted on going with him to visit her in the temporary home. The next morning, Ethan and Clara woke up early, and after a quick breakfast, the two got in the car and headed to the temporary home where Sophie was staying. The place was simple but welcoming, with a well-kept garden and a peaceful environment, far from the chaos of the city. When they arrived, Ethan was greeted by one of the caregivers, who led them to the room where Sophie was. When they entered, Sophie was sitting at a small table, drawing something with colored pencils. She looked up when she heard the door open, and when she saw Ethan, a small smile appeared on her face, but it quickly disappeared. She seemed nervous, as if she didn't know what to expect from this visit. "Hi, Sophie," Ethan said with a soft smile. "I brought Clara to meet you." Sophie looked at Clara, and her eyes sparkled for a moment, but she remained quiet, not knowing what to do. Clara, noticing the girl's shyness, approached slowly, crouching down to her height. "Hi, Sophie. I'm Clara." "It's nice to meet you," Clara said in a kind and welcoming voice. Sophie looked at her for a moment, and then, as if an invisible barrier had been broken, she replied shyly, "Hi." Clara smiled, sitting next to Sophie. "I brought you a gift if you want." She took a small book of children's stories out of her bag. I thought you might like reading or maybe drawing some stories. I love books, and I think you might too. Sophie took the book with her hands shaking a little, and for the first time, a genuine sparkle appeared in her eyes. Thank you, she murmured, almost as if she was trying to believe that someone actually thought of her. Ethan watched the scene with a heavy heart, but he also felt a wave of gratitude that Clara was there, offering a little light into Sophie's life. He approached, placing his hand on Clara's shoulder. She's so shy, he said with a sigh. I know it's hard for her to trust anyone after everything she's been through. Clara looked at him, touched by his words, and then turned her attention to Sophie. Sophie, have you read any of these stories? Or do you like making up your own? Sophie looked at the book, and her eyes softened. I like to invent. Sometimes I draw stories about magical places and animals. A world where everything is beautiful and safe. Clara felt a tightness in her chest when she heard that. I'd love to hear one of those stories one day, Sophie, she said fondly. You have a wonderful imagination. Sophie looked at Clara, as if it was the first time someone had really seen her. Can I draw a story for you? Clara smiled with a heart full of emotion. Of course, Sophie. I'd love to see. Ethan watched the interaction between Clara and Sophie, seeing the girl slowly open up. He knew it would still be a long way, but something was changing. Clara was touching Sophie's life in a way he couldn't have done alone. I think you have a bright future ahead of you, Sophie, Ethan said, his voice soft but full of emotion. And we'll be here to help you every step of the way. Sophie looked up at him and, for the first time, truly smiled. Thank you, Ethan. And thank you, Clara, she said, her voice now more confident. Clara, with teary eyes, held Sophie's hand, and the two, Ethan and Clara, felt a deep connection with the girl, as if, at that moment, they were family. Over the next few months, Ethan and Clara became regular visitors at Sophie's temporary home. Initially, the visits were filled with a tense and careful energy, but soon, as they spent more time together, the atmosphere began to transform. They always arrived with simple gifts, but full of affection. Books, toys, new clothes, and, sometimes, just a flower or a handwritten note. Each gesture was a small sign of love, an attempt to create a genuine connection with the girl, who little by little began to open up. Sophie, who was previously a shy and withdrawn girl, began to blossom in the presence of Ethan and Clara. She smiled more easily, her voice became louder, more confident, and her eyes, always somber before, now reflected a timid hope. Clara was amused to see the girl smile, while Ethan, in his protective way, began to treat her almost like a daughter. They played together, built block castles, played ball in the courtyard, and even organized small reading sessions, where Sophie loved listening to the stories told with animation. Ethan and Clara began to realize that, over time, Sophie was becoming a part of their lives, a presence that filled a silent void they had carried for so long. The bond they created with the girl brought something new and hopeful to the couple. Sophie became a reason for them to keep going, to believe that there was still a chance to form a family, even if it wasn't the way they had planned. Ethan and Clara's attachment to Sophie grew naturally, but was also filled with a deep compassion for everything she had been through. They knew that the girl had suffered more than any child should, and this brought them even closer to her. Sophie's story of pain and suffering touched their hearts in ways words couldn't express. They wanted to protect her, give her the stability and love she never had, and most of all, they wanted her to know that she was no longer alone in the world. Over time, visits became more than just moments of fun. They became opportunities to show Sophie what a home full of love, patience, and security was like. And little by little, the girl began to trust Ethan and Clara more and more, with gestures and words that showed how much she was getting attached to them. The pain she had carried for so long seemed to be softened by their presence, and although the journey was long, Ethan and Clara knew they were ready to give Sophie the home she always deserved. Ethan returned to the station when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw the name of Daniel, his childhood friend. "Hi, Daniel," Ethan replied. "Hi, Ethan. I have good news. Sophie's mother has finally lost custody of her. After all the reports, the court ruled that Sophie can no longer return to that environment. And, most importantly, she will be available for adoption." Daniel's words echoed in Ethan's mind. Can she be adopted?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with an emotion he couldn't control. Yes, she is officially available. Ethan was silent for a moment, processing Daniel's words. A wave of feelings invaded him. He thought about Sophie, about the connection that had arisen between them. Perhaps, in a strange way, fate was offering him a chance to be a father, but not in the way he had imagined. Ethan hung up the phone and remained silent, looking out the window of the police station. The day was still bright, but he felt that something important was about to change in his life. He knew he needed to talk to Clara. He needed to know what she thought, what she felt about the idea of adopting Sophie. But at the same time, he felt like something in his heart already knew the answer. Ethan arrived home, the door closing softly behind him. He was exhausted, his shoulders heavy from a long day, but his mind was distant, still processing Daniel's words. The news he had just received made him feel a mix of conflicting emotions. When he entered the living room, he saw Clara sitting on the sofa, looking at the window, as if she had been waiting for him. The silence between them seemed thicker than usual, as if they were both aware that something big was about to happen. Clara looked at him and tried to force a smile, but she saw in Ethan's eyes that something was different. He looked nervous, his fingers gripping the strap of his bag tighter than usual. He took a deep breath and approached her, sitting next to her on the couch. "Clara," her voice was softer than usual, as if she was trying to muster the strength to speak. She looked at him, her eyes curious but also worried. "What happened, Ethan? You're so serious," she asked, concern showing in her voice. She felt something was weighing on his heart. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather the right words. When he opened them again, he looked deeply into Clara's eyes, as if he was trying to convince himself that it was real, that it was possible. Sophie's mother lost custody. "She can't stay with her anymore, Clara. The court decided. Sophie is officially available for adoption." The words fell through the air like a heavy wave, and Clara fell silent, her eyes slowly widening as the news settled in her mind. She put her hand to her chest, as if she felt a tightness there, and her eyes began to fill with tears. Can she be ours?" The question came out softly, almost like a sigh, but filled with hope so intense that Ethan could barely bear it. Ethan looked at Clara, his own throat tightening as he saw the emotion brimming across her face. He knew she was feeling the same mixture of joy and fear that he felt. "Yes, Clara. She can be ours. I know it all happened so fast, and maybe it's hard to believe, but she needs us. I need her." Clara placed her hand over his, her fingers shaking slightly. "Ethan, you know what that means, don't you? Adopting a child. That changes everything. It changes our lives, our home. I never imagined it would happen, not like this. I thought we would never be parents." Her voice broke at the end, and the tears began to fall. Ethan held her hand tighter, his gaze full of emotion. "I know, Clara. I know. I also thought I would never be a father. But seeing Sophie, seeing the pain she carries and the way she's come to trust us, I feel like this is what we should do. I know we have the love, we have the heart to give it to her, and she needs it. We both need this." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of Ethan's words, but also the hope that was rising within her. She always dreamed of being a mother, but she never imagined it would be like this, with a girl who had gone through so much suffering. She looked at Ethan, seeing how determined he was, how much he had already given himself to this cause. "Ethan, you're right. She needs us. And we need it." Clara placed her head on his shoulder, her eyes closed, feeling a wave of emotions invade her. I'm with you. Let's do this. Let's give Sophie the home she deserves." Ethan hugged her tightly, his heart beating fast. "We will, Clara. Together. Let's be her family. Let's give her everything she never had." The two remained there, in silence, hugging each other, while Clara's tears mixed with the emotion that filled the house. For the first time in a long time, something felt right. The pain and sadness they carried were being softened by new hope, a chance to form the family they so desired, but in an unexpected way that touched them deeply. The next day, Ethan contacts Daniel to file the adoption papers. When Daniel receives the news, his voice brims with enthusiasm, reflecting his joy for his friends and the new chance at happiness for little Sophie. "Ethan, this is wonderful. I knew you two were the perfect parents for her. Now, with the papers, everything will be faster than we think. I know how much this girl means to you, and believe me, she also already has a special place in the hearts of everyone who knows her," Daniel says, with a tone of excitement and genuine happiness. Ethan smiles, feeling immense relief upon hearing Daniel's answer. He knew that this step was definitive, that Sophie would now have the opportunity to live a life full of love and protection. "I really can't imagine her life anywhere else, Daniel. She is part of us now. And of course, it wouldn't be possible without your help," Ethan responds, feeling the weight of responsibility become a light weight on his shoulders. "I'm happy to be part of this, friend. I will ensure that everything happens quickly and without obstacles. This will be a new life for all of you," Daniel says, before ending the conversation, promising to continue with the adoption procedures. With the certainty that the process was underway, Ethan and Clara feel a wave of emotion. They were finally one step closer to becoming a family, to providing that little girl with the stability and love she always deserved. Ethan and Clara were in the car on the way to their temporary home, both of their hearts pounding. They knew that moment would be decisive for Sophie. What once seemed like a distant dream was now becoming reality. She would finally have a family. That day, when they arrived, the temporary home was quiet. The caregiver welcomed them with a smile and led them to the room where Sophie was. The girl was sitting in a corner, playing with some toys, but as soon as she saw Ethan and Clara, her eyes lit up and she ran towards them, as if she already knew that something special was about to happen. "Hi, Sophie," Clara said with a warm smile, bending down to the girl's height. "How are you today?" Sophie smiled shyly, but her eyes were anxious, as if she was waiting for something. Ethan crouched down next to Clara, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder, and the girl looked at him, her eyes curious. "Sophie, we have something very important to tell you," Ethan began, his voice soft but full of emotion. He exchanged a look with Clara, and she squeezed his hand, feeling the tension in the air. "You know how much we love you, right? How special are you to us?" Sophie nodded quickly, her wide eyes fixed on Ethan and Clara, a slight doubt beginning to appear on her face. "So, Sophie," Clara continued, trying to control the emotion in her voice, "we have wonderful news. You won't need to stay here anymore, because you'll live with us. Let's adopt you, Sophie. You will be our daughter." Clara's words echoed in the room, and for a moment, everything was silent. Sophie looked at them, eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. She blinked several times, trying to process the news, and then, slowly, a shy smile began to form on her face. I'm going to live with you? In truth?" Sophie asked, her voice shaky, full of hope. "Yes, Sophie," Ethan said, his voice now firm but full of tenderness. "You will live with us. You will have a house full of love, and we will take care of you, give you everything you deserve." Sophie looked at the two of them, tears beginning to form in her eyes. She didn't seem to know if she was dreaming or if it was real. I never imagined this could happen. I always dreamed of this," she murmured, her voice breaking. Clara pulled her into a tight hug, feeling Sophie's body shrink in her arms. "Everything will be fine, Sophie. You won't be alone anymore. Now, you have a family. Our family." Sophie, with tears in her eyes, hugged Clara with all her strength, and then looked at Ethan, who was smiling emotionally. I don't know how to thank you. I always wanted a family, and now I have you." Ethan looked at her, his heart overflowing with love and emotion. "You don't need to thank me, Sophie. You are already part of our family. Now, let's start this new life together." The girl smiled through her tears, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. She was safe. She was loved. And finally, she had found her home. In the days that followed, Sophie moved into Ethan and Clara's house. She began to discover what it was like to have a real home, with laughter, hugs, shared meals, and the comforting feeling of security. She was no longer the girl alone in the park, with sad eyes and shoulders full of pain. Now, she was part of a family, loved and protected. Ethan and Clara, with open hearts, welcomed Sophie as their daughter, giving her the chance to grow up surrounded by love and care. They had been through so many challenges, but together they discovered that true happiness is not just in realizing your own dreams, but in sharing those dreams with those you love. Sophie's story, which began with so much suffering and loneliness, was now a tale of hope and renewal. Destiny had brought them together in an unexpected but profoundly transformative way, showing that family is not always made up of ties of blood, but of ties of the heart. And finally, they were complete. If you like this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like our videos. Also discover this other exciting story that is appearing for you on the screen. See you in the next video.